In today's project, we'll be drawing this sphere using shading and value. When we discuss value as an element of art, we are talking about the lightness or darkness of a color. Our value scale goes from the darkest darks to the lightest lights. The colors in the middle of the value scale are our midtones. Using value, we can shade objects to create more contrast and realism. There are a few different techniques we can use for shading. First is scumbling, which is using random lines like loops or swirls. Next is hatching, which is straight lines in one direction. We have cross hatching, which is straight lines that go in multiple directions. Finally, we have stippling, which is adding dots to fill in an area. The closer the dots are together, the darker the area. When we are considering shading any object, we have to think of our light source and which direction the light will be coming from. In this example, the light will be hitting the left side of my object. To draw my sphere, I start with a simple two-dimensional circle. I am also adding an ellipse below it that will become my cast shadow later on. Take note that the shadow is opposite the light source. Here is where my highlight will be. When using shading techniques, I find scumbling to be the fastest and stippling to be the slowest. Here I chose to use scumbling. It's just small loops that I'm using to fill my circle. I am being careful not to press down too hard with my pencil because I do not want to carve into my paper. If I do carve into my paper, it will make it hard to smudge and blend the graphite later on. Instead, I'm just pressing lightly and going over the area several times. Each time I go over it, the area will get darker and darker. Here you can see how the shadows and midtones are beginning to fill in. My two-dimensional circle is now looking more like a 3D sphere. We have created the illusion of form. Now I'm using a Kleenex to blend and a kneaded eraser to remove graphite. I'm going back and forth between the two to get better highlights and smoother midtones and shadows. Next, I am filling the ellipse shape to add my shadow. The layer of graphite is thicker and darker nearest the sphere and lightens up as I move away from it. I use a Kleenex to blend my graphite for a smoother look. Next, I use an eraser to clean up my edges and a ruler to add a tabletop for my sphere to sit on. When you are done with your sphere, you should have a highlight, midtones, a shadow side, and a cast shadow. If you want even more realism, add a band of reflected light on the shadow side of your sphere by erasing some of the graphite just a little bit. Reflected light happens when light bounces off of the table and hits the underside of a sphere. For our art project, we're just going to repeat these steps. I started with the circle and I'm using hatching to fill in shadows and midtones. Here I'm using a Kleenex to smudge my shading for a smoother look. A kneaded eraser is used to bring back highlights and midtones. I continue back and forth with these steps until I'm satisfied with how my sphere looks. Next, I add an ellipse for the shadow and then fill in by using scumbling, with my darkest area of the shadow being closest to the sphere. Blend with the Kleenex and clean up the edges with an eraser. I add my reflected light and a line for my horizon or tabletop. Next, I add random diagonal lines that will overlap and intersect. Inside the shapes these intersecting lines created, I'm adding random shapes and designs. I fill each section completely, going all the way to the border of each shape. When complete, you should have something that looks similar to this. These two examples were completed by 5th graders. It took them 2 45-minute classes.